Yeah, I guess I feel like the definition of terrorism that's being discussed is kind of like a non-definition, or at least a non-distinction, because even in large-scale military compact, big country against big country, there's always the real threat is the threat against a civilian population. Either it's going to be collateral damage from conventional warfare, or the implied threat is after one enemy destroys an army, the implied threat is we'll do as we wish and impose what we want on an opposing civilian population. So I'm not really seeing the distinction there.
Well, you're perfectly right, the distinction, the terms are not precise, but the terms of political discourse are not precise altogether. In fact, outside of mathematics and part of physics, terms are not really precisely defined. Even in the history of mathematics, they weren't defined until fairly recently. So these terms are loose, as you say, but nevertheless they're useful. There's a difference between terrorism and aggression. And under the category of aggression, sometimes there are actions that should count as terrorism, namely those directed as aimed at intimidating and terrifying and controlling civilian populations by violence or the threat of violence. That's a tactic that can be used within aggression. But aggression is worse than terrorism. Aggression is the dispatch of armed forces to the territory of another country without their request. I mean, that's aggression. It's pretty well defined in international conventions. And aggression is also defined in the Nuremberg principles, which are part of the foundation of modern international law. Under Nuremberg, aggression is described as I just characterized it, is identified as the supreme international crime, differing from other war crimes in that it encompasses all of the evil that follows. Those are the principles under which the Nazi war criminals were hanged, and we ought to think about them. So take, say, the invasion of Iraq. There's a textbook case of aggression, no ambiguity about it. It's U.S. British aggression. And it is the supreme international crime. It encompasses all the evil that follows, including, for example, the Sunni-Shia conflicts that had been simmering, but they were really elicited by the aggression, are now tearing the region apart. And it's that's part of the crime of aggression that we carried out. It's interesting to see the way that's discussed. So, for example, a couple of weeks ago, David Brooks in the New York Times had an article in which he argued that the real threat in the Middle East, what we really have to pay attention to, is not just hunger, massacre, and so on, but the spreading Sunni-Shia split, which is tearing the region apart. And there's some merit to that. And then he attributes that to the withdrawal of U.S. forces, or as he puts it, the withdrawal of our moderating influence. That's turning things on their head in a most grotesque fashion. It's the result of our invasion, not our moderating influence. And if we're willing to take seriously the tribunals that hanged Nazi war criminals, as we certainly should, we should ask ourselves, what does that mean for us?
But to relate it to the president, I think the context in which David Brooks wrote that article, in a situation like Syria, where the dictator with the army is seen as responsible for most of the killing of 100,000 people who at first tried to rise up peacefully, as in some other Arab Spring countries, there is a liberal internationalist view that the West, or the U.S. in particular, has a responsibility to intervene because no other power can stop the slaughter. Do you find that convincing?
Well, first of all, it's a separate point. It was not his point. His point was that it was the withdrawal of our moderating influence that led to the Sunni-Shia conflict. And in fact, it was the opposite. It was our carrying out the supreme international crime that led to it. Turning to Syria, that's a separate question. There is a doctrine of responsibility to protect. It's constantly cited. It's been, you have articles about it in the mainstream press, academic journals, and so on. And it's important to look at it because it's continually misrepresented in Western discourse, crucially misrepresented. There is a doctrine of responsibility to protect. It was approved by the United Nations General Assembly in 2005, and it therefore stands as a respectable principle of proper international behavior. Now, if you read the General Assembly proposals, resolution, what it says is, first, that states have a responsibility to protect their own citizens, and if they fail to do that, the international community has a responsibility to try to mitigate the crime and to do so in accordance with the United Nations Charter, the fundamental, the basis of modern international law. The United Nations Charter, as this resolution repeats, allows intervention under two circumstances. One, if it's authorized by the Security Council of the United Nations. Two, if it's in self-defense against armed attack until the Security Council has a chance to act. Well, the second is obviously irrelevant here, and the first is inapplicable. There's a second doctrine of responsibility to protect, which has no status other than the fact that it's accepted by the West. That's the version that came out of a committee in 2001 run by Gareth Evans, former Prime Minister of Australia. It's usually called the Evans Commission. And that develops a concept of responsibility to protect, which is the same as the one later endorsed by the General Assembly, with one crucial exception, and that's crucial. The Evans Commission adds that if the Security Council fails to act, regional organizations can carry out intervention by force in the area of their jurisdiction, subject to subsequent authorization by the Security Council. Now, there's only one regional organization that can carry out such actions. That's NATO, not for reasons of law, but for reasons of power. So what the Evans Commission is saying is, irrespective of international law, NATO has the right to intervene by force when it chooses in the area of its jurisdiction, which is worldwide. Well, that's a pretty crucial difference. The version of responsibility to protect that's discussed in the West is the Evans version. That's not the one that has any international legitimacy.